Thank you, Alex, and thank the staff of the archives and the folks at Old Alabama Town, and especially thank everyone for coming out to hear us. And I want to call out a couple of people because we do have our guidebook to the Old Federal Road coming out, and it was a really fun book to do, wasn't it, Greg and Raven? Because as we often observe, there isn't really much to see except a road on a lot of these places and a lot of missing things. But I do have some information. If you put your email address down when you registered, we will send an email and try to get a discounted offer out to you from the press when they finally get it out. They've had it long enough to do 2 books, but we won't grumble about that too much. And I also want to thank a couple of people here who were our guinea pigs for my driving directions. T.R. Henderson, who's actually the current president of the Friends of Horseshoe Bend, and Beth DeBusk, who's hiding somewhere back there, bravely took my directions into the wilderness. And I will say this, when you get that guidebook and you get lost following my directions, you won't be the first person to be lost on the Old Federal Road. So, also I'd like to thank Dr. Richard Guthrie, who was instrumental in getting some money that was a seed money for our guide many years ago. Okay, well, you know, some people in this room actually want to travel the Old Federal Road, ferret out its remains, embrace the place, as we say, and that is all well and good, and that guidebook is going to help you get there. But most of the time, I like to travel virtually. I don't mean with futuristic glasses and a computer program. I mean virtually by reading the accounts of travelers who followed the Federal Road across Alabama. And so today, I'd like to share some of their accounts and relate some of what we learned from them, with emphasis on the period after the Creek War of 1813-14. And is it possible to lower the lights a little bit so you can see the slides better? Thanks. There you go. Now to read, let's see. There we go. And to work the technology, let's see, where's the little button? There we go. Many of these travelers, indeed most, sought to experience what people from that time and ours called the picturesque and the sublime. The rigors and dangers of travel produced heightened emotional experiences. As travelers made their way through the unfamiliar, raw, and rugged landscape, they were awed and sometimes frightened out of their wits by storms, perils, and difficulties along what everyone agreed was the very worst road. These experiences with the sublime engendered wonder and a heightened appreciation for the power of the divinity, of the natural world, and of man's place in it. In a nutshell, that fear, dread, and horror was part of the reason many of these people traveled. Our travelers were also in search of the picturesque, that is, visually attractive vignettes that inspired appreciation and wonder at the world's natural beauty. Now, these scenes, while largely of the natural landscape, also included the Creek Indians. And so this morning, I'd like to take you on a virtual tour of the Old Federal Road by way of traveler descriptions, and hopefully you'll buy the book and you can read about this in greater detail pretty soon. But I want to pay particular attention to how the Creek Indians were viewed by these travelers. I'll conclude with some rather unsublime observations about the impact of the road and those travelers on the Creek people and their land. Sensory experiences of the southern landscape had a profound impact on travelers of the Federal Road. The power of violent and unpredictable storms, the hazards of night travel, the terrain and encounters with native people at ease in these settings both frightened and fascinated visitors. Experiencing such ordeals, titillating dangers, and novel scenes inspired many travelers to pen picturesque vignettes that count among the richest literary accounts of early Alabama. They reveal both the natural beauty of the region and the emotional reactions aroused by travelers' encounters with the unfamiliar landscape and its inhabitants. Many travelers found the region an enchanting wilderness of mesmerizing visual tableaus. Night brought, and Plenty of quotes are about to follow. But night brought moving lights of fireflies that delighted with their beauty, evanescent as it was. The observant might marvel during the day at tassels of black butterflies hanging from the extremity of twigs of blooming sourwood. Travelers also found the sonic landscape compelling, whether their ears were stunned with the frog concerts or the crash of near thunder. As one traveler and his fellow passengers walked through the night forest, he thought nothing could be more beautiful than the scene presented by the forest. The glare of our torches as we continued slowly advancing amid the darkness, the fires of the Indian encampment seen at a distance through the trees, and the wild figures by which they were surrounded, the multitude of fireflies which flickered everywhere among the foliage, formed a combination of objects which more than compensated in picturesque beauty for all the difficulties we had yet encountered. Women travelers frequently noticed the native wildflowers. During her 1830 spring ride to Montgomery, Anne Royal reported, "The whole southern country is one garden of flowers." Harriet Martineau expressed delight on her travels through the Creek Nation in 1835 at finding the woods superb in their spring beauty. She felt awe for the grandest flower of all, perhaps the most exquisite I ever beheld, the honeysuckle of the southern woods. Counterpoised with such scenes of natural beauty were not infrequent scenes of natural devastation. In 1820, along the southern stretch of the road, traveler Adam Hodgson encountered evidence of a tornado or a hurricane. He wrote, "It was one of the most sublimely dreadful spectacles I ever beheld. Thousands of large pine trees lay torn and shattered on each other, only 1 in 4 or 5 having been left standing, ravages of which extended nearly 12 miles. And there were plenty of natural curiosities at taverns and stage stops. One traveler encountered the stuffed skins of 3 extraordinarily thick diamond rattlesnakes on the porch of Mr. Cook's Tavern. Stuffed panthers, bear skins, and other animal remains draw appreciative comments from visitors all along the Federal Road where such trophies were displayed. The vast wilderness frequently left travelers forlorn with almost overwhelming feelings of isolation. After riding miles along the Federal Road in 1832 and seeing neither habitation nor an inhabitant to disturb the solitude and majesty of the wilderness, a melancholy John Howard Payne wrote in a letter to a friend about feelings he said he could not describe. Adam Hodgson, too, traversed a most solitary pine barren on a high ridge on the southern stretch of the road in 1820 when he spotted a finger post of wood fastened to a tree pointing down a grass path on which was written 2 Pensacola. And suddenly he wrote, "I felt more lonely and more distant from home at that moment than at any time since I lost sight of my native shores." Even as late as 1839, travelers might proceed for miles in succession, seeing neither a human being, a fence, a rood of cleared land, nor anything indeed that could indicate the presence of man. "We felt," wrote another traveler, an Englishman, "the solitude of the woods in all its fullness." The poet and novelist William Gilmore Simms captured, better than most I think, the heightened sensory experiences of a traveler on the Federal Road as the natural and cultural milieus combined to render an indelible memory, which he reported in a letter to his friend. And I'll read a section of that. He wrote, "Stiffened with cold, knee-deep in mud and water, and anxious to proceed, in fear of losing the next stage from Fort Mitchell to Montgomery, I could not help but admiring the high degree of picturesque which entered into the scene around me. The shouting of the Indians in self-encouragement and in their quick, detached, and fragmentary language, the cheerings of our own party, innumerable torches scattered about the woods and on the marge of the swollen waters, the rushing of the waters themselves, the neighing and struggling of the horses up to their middles in the creek swamp, added to the cheerless and wild character of the prospect. And these associations, which in vain sought to reconcile the present with the past fortunes and labors of the Indian tribes, all combined to give a graphic force to a picture worthy of the pencil of a Rembrandt, which, as you see, much later Frederick Remington provided. For many travelers, the Indians living along the road, the upper part of the road from Fort Mitchell to Lion Creek, were simply part of the exotic wild landscape. As traffic increased along the Federal Road after the Creek War, the First Creek War, the Indians became both attractions and outfitters for tourists. Indian proprietors established and ran the first tavern and stage stops, and other creeks established ferries and toll bridges. Before long, white operators replaced native ones, and increasingly Indians became marginalized as immigrants and travelers found ways to avoid payments at river crossings, which the Indians were entitled to. Still, creeks remained fixtures along the road as guides, selling produce and souvenirs, laboring in the taverns and inns that proliferated along the road, and performing various menial chores and working for hire. And I love this little cartoon, which is from much later, but if you look, you can see it depicts the Indians holding up a bridgeway for General Lafayette when he crossed, and also assisting at river crosses, which was one of the main occupations of what people called the road Indians. In the 1820s and 30s, encountering Indians on the Federal Road was surely part of the allure for tourists. General Lafayette's traveling party first sighted Indians at the Creek Agency near Macon, Georgia, as the Indians were drying clothes around a large fire at a house not far from the road. Lafayette's secretary likely summed up the attitudes of most foreign travelers. "My attention," he wrote, "was keenly excited by this encounter with the Indians, the first I had had of this kind. I had heard so much spoken of the customs of these men of nature, and like all who live in a civilized country, I had formed such a singular idea of them that the least of their gestures, the tiniest part of their clothing and their armor, was as greatly a cause for astonishment for me as was in turn the fact that the Indians appeared to experience nothing at all upon seeing us." I think they were hiding it pretty well. Whenever opportunities presented itself, travelers stopped to visit Indian towns, watch Indian ball play, view children at their games, or simply observe the creeks in their own communities. Some even took the time to learn a few Muskogee words. Others listened eagerly to tales of Indian massacres and attack, both real and mythical. Anne Royal found the road between Columbus and Montgomery strewn with Indian camps in the cooler months, where creeks sold corn and venison, as well as what she described as Indian corn leaves, which served as horse fodder for travelers in the absence of hay. Now, these were corn shucks, like the lighter wood torches that the Indians made, were sold to travelers and represented the work of Creek women, whose traditional roles involved not only agricultural production, but the collection of firewood. Women also fashioned beaded moccasins and finger-woven bandolier bags for sale, and Creek women tended to travelers' needs at inns and taverns as cooks, waitresses, and maids. The cultural diversity and changing domestic economy of the Creek country was evident on the tables and inns and taverns along the Federal Road. Bacon, eggs, roasted chickens, cream, and butter testified to the presence of hogs, chickens, and dairy cattle in the region. These domesticated animals had been introduced in the 18th century and adopted readily by Creek in-laws of colonial deerskin traders. These animals transformed not only Creek foodways, but the very environment of the Southeast. Cattle and pigs in particular decimated river-bottom cane breaks, and, like chickens, brought animal filth and litter into the heart of Indian settlements. The result of these new animals was a new Southern cuisine which rapidly developed and was in evidence along the road. Food prepared and served by Indian women and enslaved Africans, and it represented a true fusion of ingredients, cuisines, and serving styles. William Potts in 1828 observed the manner in which inventive Creek women at Big Warrior's stand turned age-old techniques to new purposes by preparing coffee using a traditional mortar pestle, and sifter, which would have been used earlier for corn, but now they were cracking coffee beans. Potts wrote, "The coffee was poured into a hollowed stump and beat with a stick of wood until mashed up, and then it was sifted into a basket. The Reverend judged the coffee thick, one would imagine. The Indian women's ham and chicken dishes bad, and their cornbread made from a traditional method of fermented corn dough, he reckoned very sour." And on and on and on it went, with venison and corn mainstays for most tavern meals. The temporary structures and camps that Indians established along the roads did not impress visitors. Tyrone Power, an actor who traveled, found that their condition wretched in the extreme. Most of the families were living in wigwams, which is what he called these, built of bark or green boughs of the frailest and least comfortable construction, not an article of furniture except a kettle. Others more accurately describe these structures as traditional shelters used as winter hunting camps, but now built near the Federal Road to access the market created by traveling Americans. These rude dwellings consisted of, according to one traveler, 4 upright saplings and a rough covering of pine bark, which they stripped from the trees with a neatness and rapidity which we could not imitate. These dignified and stoic residents of the road made a very picturesque appearance, according to more than one traveler. Most exchanges involved sign language, or pantomime, as John Howard Payne called it, although a fair share of Creeks did speak English. Payne himself was involved in an encounter with Indian women on a branch of the Federal Road going to the Creek town of Tuckabashie in 1835, when he encountered 2 Creek women and asked them how far he and his traveling companions were from their destination. The women, he wrote, half covered a finger to express that it was half a mile further, and smiling added, "Sneezer, much," meaning that we should find lots of our brethren, the sneezers, at Tuckabashie. And of course, sneezer is not exactly a pleasant term. The majority of the Creek population lived in towns and on outlying plantations, virtually all at some distance from the Federal Road, Casita and Tuckabashie being 2 important exceptions. Casita, a large Creek town on the east bank of the Chattahoochee, was a frequent stopping place for travelers who reached the river. Until its inhabitants were forcibly removed following the cession of their land to Georgia, that town boasted over 100 homes, gardens, a traditional townhouse, a town square, and a chunky yard. In other words, traditional Creek architecture. And it was after 1826, with the loss of their land to Georgia, that the American town of Columbus grew up near the site. Travelers loved to play jokes on their traveling companions, and more than one thought to involve the Indians. Playing on the fears of fellow travelers, P.T. Barnum and Buckingham Smith, both performers who were traveling on the Federal Road to get to New Orleans for their work there, hired Creek Indians to stage mock stake attacks and chases, paid them for the trouble, and enjoyed all the while the discomfort of their companions who thought they were under real attack by Indians. You see P.T. Barnum doing that? Some Creek Indians, like Hamley, a young man who met up with General Lafayette's traveling party, spoke very good English. Hamley, who had been educated in the States, lived in a well-furnished and hospitable house and entertained the traveling Frenchman by playing Indian tunes on his violin. The General Secretary thought the house where Hamley lived with his 2 wives indicated the presence, as he put it, of a half-civilized man. Today, we consider Hamley a prime example of a Creek man who was, like many of his fellow Creeks, creatively adapting to changing times. The French writer added that the young man had a remarkable stature and beauty. Okay, this isn't Hamley, but I want you to pay attention to Mackintosh's clothing, because Hamley was dressed in the latest Creek fashion, which Mackintosh also sports in his portrait. Hamley wore a fringed coat, had a bandolier bag with little beads of 1,000 colors, according to the French writer, and he wore a turban fashioned from brightly colored shawl, which he had elegantly wrapped around his head. Hamley told the visitors he had escaped from the American school because he preferred living among his own people. He protected also enslaved Africans who had run away from the American territory, and these people paid Hamley for his hospitality, as he called it, by working for him. Hamley's house and living arrangements represented an interesting admixture of traditional Creek values and new adaptations to American culture. Like all Creeks who operated taverns and inns and lived in proximity to the road, he was familiar with American and European cultural practices and outlooks. And, like most other Creeks of mixed ancestry, he fully identified as Creek and was helping to redefine Creek identity and culture. He told his visitors, a sworn enemy of William McIntosh, who had just been executed by the Creek people for illegally selling Creek lands to Georgia. McIntosh's actions were the beginning of an all-out move to force the Creeks off their land. And travelers along the federal road witnessed many of the upheavals and the ultimate removal of the Creeks from the southern states. A work of plunder and corruption via treaties, a disgusted George Fanshawe called it. The increase in American settlements around Creeks had resulted in, as Fanshawe noted, he was an English traveler, the total dissolution of order. He observed Indians begging, stealing whiskey, and the rampant drunkenness of those whose lives had been shattered by the loss of their land. After the cession of their Georgia land following the Treaty of Washington in 1826, which had resulted from McIntosh's actions, lower Creeks were attempting to resettle. Creeks who had lived in Georgia were attempting to resettle on Creek lands that they still held in what we now think of as the state of Alabama. And they were, as Basil Hall, whose little drawings you've been seeing, observed, wandering about like bees whose hive has been destroyed. With the Creek Nation in political disarray, nothing could curb the actions of unscrupulous white squatters and land speculators who cheated Indians along the border and indeed in their own territory. More than one traveler witnessed the callous disregard for Indian rights and feelings by those who cheated, abused, and insulted them as the roads split their nation in two. When talk of Indian removal came up during a dinner at Lewis's Tavern, the Reverend William Potts engaged in what he described as a warm debate with a fellow traveler who was disposed to take sides against the Creeks. Potts' sympathies clearly lay with the Indian women, even though they made thick coffee, who had stoically cooked and served the travelers' meals and endured their insults. A few years later, with forced removal underway, the Englishman James Buckingham asked an Indian woman at a tavern if indeed removal was not a blessing. She made no answer, he wrote, but he later learned that the innkeeper, who he described as a half-blood Indian, was so enraged when the question was repeated to him that he went perfectly mad, in the language of our informant, and declared his regret that he had missed the opportunity to shoot me for saying so. As tensions mounted, attacks on settlers and travelers increased. Tales of robbery and murder, most of them exaggerated, actually did cause P.T. Barnum and his traveling companions to arm themselves with guns, pistols, and Bowie knives. Mounting violence between Creek and Americans by 1836 escalated into the Second Creek War. In addition to looting white settlements along the Chattahoochee, Creeks, enraged over the encroachment and abuse by white settlers, again focused on roadways, just as the war had been the focus for the First Creek War. By May, attacks on stagecoaches effectively halted travel through the Creek Nation. Armed Creeks destroyed bridges, burned stages, and killed passengers. In July 1836, one federal officer at an Army encampment near Tuskegee reported that between Fort Mitchell and Tuskegee, at least 9/10 of the dwellings and farmhouses are consumed. On Friday, we passed the spot made famous by the attack on the 4 stages. The coaches, horses, and all must have been burned where they stood. 2 wheels only remain, besides the bones of the horses and the ironworks of the carriages. The United States Army quickly contained that Creek rebellion, and the United States government used this occasion to accelerate forced removal of all remaining Creeks from the state of Alabama. Only a handful had actually participated in this violence, but the federal road, again, was used for this purpose. Captured Creek men were marched from Fort Mitchell on the Chattahoochee toward Montgomery under the guard of federal troops. They were wrote one traveler, handcuffed two together and a long chain passing between the double file connecting them all. Among those who witnessed this sorry affair was John James Audubon, famous avian artist, who arrived at Fort Mitchell in February 1837 to find 100 Creek men confined in irons. As he progressed westward, he overtook about 2,000 Creeks being marched towards Montgomery. The scene of Indians in sorrow, he wrote in a letter to his friends, produced on my mind an afflicting series of recollections more powerfully felt than easy of description. The numerous groups of warriors, of half-clad females and naked babies, trudging through the mire under the residue of their ever-scanty stock of camp furniture and household utensils. The evident regret expressed in the masked countenances of some and the tears of others, the howlings of their numerous dogs and the cool demeanor of their chiefs, all form such a picture as I hope I will never again witness in reality. Travel writers also recorded the environmental devastation that occurred as settlers poured into the state of Alabama. Charles Lyell, a geologist, on his second visit to the state in 1846, or to America, stopped to inspect trees felled for cotton fields. Growth rings of the trees, cut generally 2 to 3 feet from the ground, revealed a forest of centenarians with 120 to 320 years of growth. Sadly, he noted, no such trees will be seen by posterity, as he mused on how many years will it take to restore such a forest now that it is destroyed. Such massive forest clearings resulted in deepening erosional gullies and silt-choked rivers, was, to be mild, an ecological nightmare. Regarding the growth of Columbus, Georgia, now on the site of an Indian town, Creek Indian town, the cotton mills springing up along the Chattahoochee River, Lyell noted a large proportion of the fish, formerly so abundant, have been stifled by the mud. His impressions came a week after the last detachment of Creek Indians left Columbus, Georgia, forcibly deported to the Indian Territory. So the Federal Road was a conduit that enabled both immigration and deportation on a massive scale. The unfortunate reality was simply this. By the mid-1830s, settlers and the enslaved had replaced the indigenous population of the region. Cultural reordering began immediately following the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ended the Creek War of 1813-14. The rich soils of the Black Belt and river bottomlands acted as magnets for those who had been afflicted with Alabama fever, as it was called. By the mid-1830s, travelers could see cotton bales loaded on steamboats at Montgomery and Claiborne and warehouses all along the Alabama River. As travelers peered from their carriages that once passed through seemingly endless forests, they now saw, and I'm quoting, extensive fields of the richest soil, perfectly cleared of all timber. They could see slaves working on either side of the road. By power of the road, the region had been transformed from a multicultural Creek country to biracial Alabama, a slave society based on cotton agriculture. For the Creeks, who opposed the building of the road through their territory from the very beginning and were horribly offended by Luckett's carving those Roman numerals onto their trees, it truly had been a road that led to destruction. Thank you.